Hello and welcome to the Tough Girl podcast, which is all about motivating and inspiring you. I'm your host, Sarah Williams. So today's episode is almost like a two-part episode. So there is a new book which has recently come out called Hudson Bay Bound. 2 women, 1 dog, 2,000 miles to the Arctic. Hudson Bay Bound was written by the author Natalie Warren, but Natalie did this journey with one of her best friends, Anne Raiho, and Anne is who we're going to be speaking to today. So Anne is going to be sharing more about her perspective of the journey, the 85-day journey, when she became part of the 2 women to canoe the 2,000-mile route from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. Anne's going to be sharing more about her journey into canoeing, the challenges involved, what she learned along the way. But you're also going to be able to listen to another episode, which will be coming out in the next couple of days, with Natalie as well. So you're going to be able to hear the 2 perspectives of both women on this journey. So the book is called Hudson Bay Bound. It's 2 women, 1 dog, 2,000 miles to the Arctic. And on this episode, we're going to be catching up with Anne. She's going to start by telling us a little bit more about who she is and what her childhood was like growing up.
My name is Anne Raiho, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at Colorado State University. But I work with the National Park Service on predicting which types of landscapes will be more resilient to climate change within the national parks in Alaska. And I grew up in Minnesota, in Inver Grove Heights, which is outside of St. Paul. My parents both worked for the federal government. My mom worked for immigration and my dad worked for the U.S. Post Office. And I was just an only child. My parents had me a little bit later in life. And so I've always been kind of like their special girl. And they had a cabin, which is pretty common for people in Minnesota to have a cabin to go to on the weekends. But the special thing about my parents' cabin is that it was about 5 hours north, and it was along the Minnesota and Canadian border in the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness. And so I grew up going up there with my dad, and there's most of the lakes up there are just for canoeing, but we lived on, or they had their cabin on a lake that allowed motors. And so my dad's really into fishing for walleye, and we would go out fishing a lot when I was younger. And still do whenever I can make it back to go up to the cabin where they now live most of the time or half of the year.
So in my head, I'm just imagining, now this could be completely wrong, like the traditional wooden log cabins with limited facilities. Did you have running water and electricity when you went up to the cabin, or is it a bit more sort of rustic?
The original cabin that they purchased was more rustic, like you're thinking, but it actually burned down in 2007 in the Ham Lake fire. And so now they've rebuilt, but it is made of all logs, and even one log that was able to be salvaged from the fire. So it's like it has a bathroom and everything, but the bathroom only works during the summer, and then in the winter you have to use the outhouse or kind of go somewhere else, which they have another place in Duluth, Minnesota that they can go to in the winter.
Yeah. When you were a little girl growing up, what did you dream about becoming? What did you wanted to be when you were older?
That's a good question. I think when I was younger, I wanted to be an astronaut or somebody that, went on kind of these crazy adventures. Yeah, and I think every kid wants to be like an astronaut when they grow up. But I think that my parents brought me down to Huntsville, Alabama to go to space camp. And so for a while, I was really hooked in. We won our Mars mission competition there. And so one of the reasons I got into math in college is because I thought maybe someday I could go the astronaut route.
So let's talk a little bit more about canoeing. So you first started, canoeing with your dad and stuff. Did you go on like canoeing courses, canoeing camps? What was sort of like your canoeing progression?
Well, Natalie and I both also went to a camp near my parents' cabin called YMCA Camp Minogen. And when you're 13, you start with a 1-week trip just in the Boundary Waters area there. And then as you get older, the trips get longer and further away. And so that's where Natalie and I met, going on a 50-day canoe trip in Nunavut, Canada through Camp Minogen.
But I want to talk about what happened after you graduated college, because I know that you and Natalie were sort of, you were having trouble finding jobs after college, and that's when, you came together to make this decision about the next sort of adventure and challenge that you were going to do. Do you just want to take us back to that time and tell us a little bit more about what happened?
Yes, it was January 2011, and at St. Olaf we had a break, or like you could take them like before you went back from Christmas. There was a long break, and so I was in Miami visiting Natalie, and we were kind of applying for jobs. And at this point, a lot of our friends had jobs, but we really didn't have a plan next. And so we were kind of talking about what we could do and talking about how we'd been on this long canoe trip before. And then I went home or back to school after my trip to Miami, and I was looking through my bookshelf and I saw this book, Canoeing with the Cree. And I was kind of rereading it and thinking about it. And then I got online and was checking to see if people had recreated this journey. So Canoeing with the Cree was written by Eric Severin. It was about their 1930 trip from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. And I found a couple of men who had completed the trip, but I didn't find any all female groups who'd done it before. So I basically brought the book back with me to college and gave it to Natalie and was like, we should do this. We should be, the first women to paddle from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay. And Natalie is really always up for anything. And so she kind of jumped at it and really was the driving force in making it happen.
Why did you want to go on this trip?
I think there's something special about going on trips that are a little bit longer. I always try to tell people who are nervous about camping that they should try to go on a trip that's at least 2 weeks long at some point, because after that, that's when the magic happens, at least for me. And so all during college, I sort of missed going on these longer trips that I was going on in high school. And so I just wanted mostly an excuse to get out there for just longer than the 50 days that we'd spent before canoeing.
Yeah. Now, you said it was a book that you read, Canoeing with the Cree. What's the Cree?
The Cree are First Nations people in northern Manitoba. And so that's actually where we stopped to go. They have a festival called York Boat Days. And so after Lake Winnipeg, we stayed with a Cree family on Norway House Reservation and attended York Boat Days. And we actually ended up picking up a stray dog while we were there.
Before we actually get onto the trip, I'm always fascinated by the planning and the preparation. How long did you give yourself before you decided on the date of when you were going to head off? How did you divide up the roles? Did you need to get extra equipment? Did you need to do any training for it? How sort of seriously or how relaxed were you about taking this adventure?
Well, we had a lot of planning to do before we left. Mostly we needed a lot of stuff. And so we went to a convention called Canoecopia, which is in Madison, Wisconsin every year. And we kind of went around to the different booths with a packet that said, we wanted to be the first women to paddle from Minneapolis to Hudson Bay, and kind of pitched our idea to them. And I was sort of skeptical at this point that anybody was going to think that we were cool or that this was a good idea. But at Canoecopia, everyone was really excited about it because they've all read this book, Canoeing with the Cree, and so we started getting a lot of stuff basically at Canoecopia. We got some bags and like Duluth packs to put our gear in, and we got a canoe and paddles and sleeping bags and clothes and food sponsors and all sorts of stuff. And so that was kind of like the moment for me that made it much more serious because people were really interested in us doing this. About the roles, I guess, Natalie and I, I guess, were just together all the time because at that point we were both trying to finish up all our classes for environmental studies and also playing Frisbee together. The big season is in the spring, and then trying to plan this trip. So I don't know if we had really specific roles. I think we were just kind of tied at the hip doing everything together.
One of the things I always like to talk about is the money as well. The costs of doing an expedition like this, taking on this 2,250-mile trip. So it's coming to the end of college, and I know that college in America can be pretty expensive. So in terms of finances and paying for the trip, how did you figure that out, and what sort of budget were you working with?
We made a website, which now seems like no big deal, but back then we didn't have like Squarespace or anything like that. So we kind of had to get a friend of ours and who is a computer science major to help us get our own like Hudson Bay bound URL and put like a button on there where you could send us money. And then we had to figure out, if we had it through PayPal, like how much was PayPal going to get versus us. So we had a PayPal button on there where people could donate. And basically, we had to raise enough money to buy food and to buy the flight home. But then, because we had most of the gear sponsored, so we just had to figure that out. And I think it was about like $8,000 to fly us and the canoe back. So that was kind of our goal. And we threw a party to get more people to donate, which worked pretty well. And a lot of our friends and family, really chipped in, which was obviously a privilege and very helpful. Yeah, because we were just poor college students. And I was working at the Rockwell, and I think Natalie was working at like a pizza place on campus. So yeah, we pulled it together kind of at the end. And I think we were even still looking for more money on our while we were canoeing.
So how long was your planning and preparation stage before you started on the trip?
Yeah, so we decided in January we were going to go, and we left on June 2nd, which was like a week after I think school finished. And so we didn't have much time to prep there, but because we'd done a longer trip before, we kind of knew, we needed food, we needed to plan where we were going to get more food, and then we needed to make sure we had all the maps and everything. But I think that because of the trips we went on during high school, we were kind of well prepped to make decisions quickly and make it happen kind of fast.
I mean, you've been friends for a long time, and you have done, canoe trips before 15 days, 30 days, your longest being 50 days. But this was going to be, an even longer time period together, spending 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, relying on each other for everything when you're out on the river, out in that environment. Did you have any concerns with regards to your friendship and how that would go? Did you discuss what you would do if somebody was annoying you, or you were going to have a disagreement about something that you needed to do together? Did you have those types of conversations before? Was that something that was even a consideration?
We did talk about it before. We talked about how we should probably go to like some therapy or something. But we didn't end up doing that because, we had all this stuff going on and we had to get ready to go. But I wish that we would have thought about it a little bit more, because I think there were times, even though we are these good friends, 85 days, like only 6 feet apart is a lot. And I definitely internalized some of my being annoyed with Natalie when I should have brought it up. And then that kind of had a negative feedback for me, where I was kind of feeling well, I shouldn't be mad at her or something. And then feeling like I was, not being the coolest person to be on a canoe trip. And so I wish we would have talked about it a little bit more, I guess, where I was only 21 at the time. And so I guess I hadn't really experienced that much alone time with one other person yet. So I didn't know exactly how to reach out to other people. But in retrospect, I think that it would be good if anyone out there is planning on going on a trip with just one other person for a really long time, that you have kind of some kind of way to vent, because that would have been key for me.
Yeah. I think it's really important, because I think it's easy to forget, because when you're doing a physical challenge, that you're doing, paddling every single day, you're covering big distances. So you're tired, you're exhausted mentally, everything that you're seeing is brand new. So there's a lot going on physically, mentally, emotionally even. And it can be very, very stressful in some situations. I mean, talking about stress and maybe challenges that you faced while you were out on the trip. Reflecting back now, what do you think was one of the biggest challenges that you had to overcome while you were out there?
Well, the biggest challenge for sure was Lake Winnipeg. It's the 11th largest lake in the world by surface area. And before we went, people would pull us aside and be like, don't paddle Lake Winnipeg. In the book, Canoeing with the Cree, they get on a steamship to cross part of Lake Winnipeg. And so that was kind of the climax of the trip, because the first parts, paddling upstream, we knew would be really difficult. And then we knew Lake Winnipeg would be really hard, but then we felt confident about the more wilderness, like whitewater afterward. And so Lake Winnipeg represented a lot of stress for like building it up. And then while we were doing it too. And we definitely had different ideas about how we should do it, which are a little bit hard to compromise on sometimes. Natalie is much more gung-ho about like paddling all night and far from shore to save time so we could, get off the lake faster. So there was definitely a lot of times where we were talking to each other about what we should do and disagreeing. And then definitely there was nobody else out there, because it's not super inhabited lake. So it was just a lot of like 3 weeks of basically of alone time, like making decisions about crossing this huge lake.
How did you resolve the disagreements while you were out on the water?
Well, sometimes we did a good job of, making compromises. Like if one person felt uncomfortable, then we would just do whatever it took to make them feel comfortable. But, after a couple of weeks of that, I think that both of us were feeling a little bit like we wanted to be in charge, and make the decisions. And so one night in particular, we were out there and it was a perfectly flat night. So there was really nothing to worry about except, that we're on the 11th largest lake in the world, like 2 miles from shore in the middle of the night. And I was telling Natalie, I feel uncomfortable and we should go into shore. And she was steering. And so, but then she didn't really turn the boat. And obviously, I knew that she wasn't turning the boat. And, so I got pretty upset and we kind of like stopped talking. And so we were paddling in silence. But then, she interrupted the silence to be like, isn't this amazing? We're like paddling like through a galaxy right now, because the stars, there was a new moon. And so we could see all the stars, the Milky Way, and we could see them both above us and in the water. And so at that point, it's just kind of like, well, this is an amazing thing that we're doing. And like, we don't need to be arguing about how close to shore we are. And she eventually did turn the boat in. And right where she paddled into shore, there was a moose standing there. And so when we turned on our light to see like how close we were, you could see this like big green eyes, like 8 feet up in the air. So that was kind of a sign that like, even though you're going to have disagreements, like you don't always need to be right, and like it'll work out because of, just the way that, we both had so much experience and our friendship was so strong.
Did you know before you went on the trip that you'd end up writing a book about it? Like, where did the book come from? Was that always like part of the plan, or is that something that came out much sort of later? How did that happen?
We talked about it a lot because, we were doing this trip based on a book. So we thought, it would be important to write a book that was written by women about the trip. And that there was a lot of things that were different now between 1930 and, I'm an ecologist now and have always been interested in the environment. And there's definitely a lot of like environmental issues that came up along the trip. So we definitely always talked about it. But then Natalie really took charge of that because that's her kind of field, environmental communication. And she's much more like bold about telling stories. Like she's not shy about like putting it all out there and like being vulnerable and creative. And so I'm like really excited to see how the book turns out. I haven't actually read it yet, even though it's coming out in February. And because I think that, Natalie does a really good job of like seeing the bigger picture and drawing it all together. So
did Natalie sort of speak to you to get your contributions, or did you write any parts of it, or is it more, is the book going to be more from like Natalie's point of view?
I don't I think that it's just from Natalie's point of view. She kept asking me to say, because we kept pretty detailed journals. She kept asking me to send my journal, and I was kind of being a little hesitant because I really wanted it to be, from her perspective. But then when I knew she was finished and she got the publishing deal and everything, then I sent along the journal. And so I don't know if she edited anything into it, but yeah, it's mostly from Natalie's perspective. And then they asked me a few questions for the afterward. So yeah, I have a little bit of a voice at the end, I think.
I think that's really fascinating because how I use journaling is sometimes to write down my fears, write down my frustrations, write down my anger, write down things which are annoying me and I need to physically get out of my body. Had you done that journaling when you were having sort of disagreements out on the water? And were you a little bit concerned that Natalie would then read what you'd written from, 11 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I specifically had written pretty, I would say mean things or something about that night that I was telling you about. And so I had ripped those pages out a long time ago because I felt like I didn't like myself in that moment or something. And I didn't want Natalie to ever find out about that because, she's my best friend and I wouldn't want her to think that I ever thought anything negative about her really. And so, but I ripped them out and I'd put them in the back. And so when I went to mail my journal to her, I kind of we have such a strong friendship now that I don't think anything like that I could have said then would really affect, how she feels about me. So and I wanted her to know, I guess how I was feeling in the moment. So I kind of taped them back in there. And I think she read that part and I don't think we're still good. So.
Tell us about the dog that you met.
Yeah, so we had been talking about how it would be so fun to have a dog in the canoe with us. And then when we got to Norway House, the family we were staying with was telling us that if we didn't have a dog, when we got to Hudson Bay, there would be fog and we wouldn't be able to see polar bears sneaking up on us in the fog. But that if we could put the dog in the canoe, then the dog could sniff the polar bears out. And so we were totally convinced by that and went around during the festival looking at different stray dogs. And we had kind of one picked out, but then we didn't pick the dog up and we went back to their house. And then at night they were like, well, you need a dog, for tomorrow. So we went out at night looking for a dog and we couldn't find one. But then we saw this puppy run across the street and into a parking lot where the festival was happening. And she was eating ketchup packets between two cars. And I was actually too scared to pick her up. So Natalie grabbed her and put her in the van that the family was driving. And we still have the picture of her kind of looking around in the van. And then we brought her back to the house and gave her a bunch of hot dogs because we didn't have dog food. And the next day we put her in the canoe and she's here in my house right now. She kind of became my dog after the trip. Yeah, she's doing good.
Oh, that's so lovely. 2011, you're 21 years old, you're recreating this journey. In terms of the people that you met along the way, because the book that you based it on, Canoeing with the Cree, did you meet any people from the Cree?
Yeah, this family at Norway House they were Cree people, and they're the Mushwagans. Mike Mushwagan used to be a chief at Norway House, but I think now he's on the board or something. And so in Canoeing with the Cree, they actually bring somebody who is Cree along with them. But so we wanted to, meet them, and some male group that had completed the trip before had stayed with the Mushwagans before. And so we kind of reached out to them and stayed with them again. And then there's actually another reservation called Oxford House where we stopped and met more Cree people when we were there. So we met some people and we still keep in touch with the Mushwagan family and kind of send them pictures of Maihan, which is the dog's name. And Maihan means wolf in Cree.
Yeah. I mean, reflecting back now, when you were 21 years old, going out on this incredible journey with your best friends over 2,000 miles, one canoe, obviously learning a lot about yourself and your friendship. But what do you think the biggest lesson is that you've managed to take away from that experience that you apply to your life going forward?
Well, I think there's two things. And the first thing is kind of something that I think a lot of people come away with these experiences feeling like, if you really want to do something, it's in your power to do it. I think this trip to a lot of people, 2,000 miles in a canoe with one person, crossing all these different kinds of bodies of water seems impossible. But, if you really have the right person with you and you put your mind to it and, do the preparation beforehand, you really can accomplish anything. And the second thing is just this being kind to yourself and having a lot of self-compassion in these trying moments. I think that back then I was being pretty hard on myself about how I was feeling about Natalie. And if I would have just taken a second to think about this is like Winnipeg and you're in a pretty tough situation trying to paddle across it in this canoe, that, I could have felt better about it and not, just kept going a little bit better. Does that make sense?
It does. And sometimes, I mean, obviously, hindsight, you're rose tinted glasses, when you look back, you think, I could have communicated in this way. But sometimes sometimes it's just not that easy because you just don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. And,
right. Yeah.
And sometimes you just end up bottling it all up inside yourself just to, to keep the peace. I get that. Is canoeing still a part of your life now?
Yeah, we, Natalie just had a baby, so it's a little bit less, but in 2016, we paddled the Yukon River Quest, which is a race, a 444-mile race from Whitehorse to Dawson City in the Yukon. And it was me and Natalie and then 4 of our good canoeing friends. And so we actually ended up winning our division, the women's Voyageur. And so that was pretty cool.
That's very cool. So do you train pretty hard for that? Are you sort of out there 3-4 times a week, or is it more like a hobby and for fun?
It's more of a hobby for fun. When I was going to graduate school at Notre Dame, I did a little bit more canoeing because there was a river right through town, and then some people who are really into race canoeing. So they would go out pretty often. But right now in Colorado, there's less water and I don't have a solo canoe. So it's more like something that I do as just a hobby and when I can. But I try to get up to, my parents' cabin in the Boundary Waters to go at least once a year. And a lot of my friends are canoeists and I try to get them, to do kind of crazy stuff with me all the time.
Oh, I like that. That sounds good. And where's the best place for people to either follow you and your adventures on social media, and also the best place to get a copy of the book?
I have a pretty active Twitter for my research. It's just Ann, A-N-N, Raiho, R-A-I-H-O. And then I'm on Instagram, but I mostly post pictures of my dog. And so if her name's Maihan, the canoe dog, on Instagram. Yeah, and then get a copy of the book. I think it's up for, I'm not sure what you call a pre-sale on the University of Minnesota Publishing Press website.
Fantastic. And I'd love for you to leave our listeners with final words of advice for other women who are thinking, do you know what, I want to go on an adventure. I want to get into canoeing. I want to step outside my comfort zone. What advice would you have for them?
I think that just to take the first step and believe in yourself and, really find strength in people who are going to support you. Natalie and I, nobody really told us we couldn't do it. I think that's because, we surrounded ourselves with this community that just believed in us. So really dig deep into your community and set off for your dreams.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for coming on Tough Girl Podcast. It's been epic to speak to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey Tribe, I hope you enjoyed the episode with Anne. My name is Sarah Williams and I'm the host of the Tough Girl Podcast and the founder of Tough Girl Challenges, which is all about motivating and inspiring you. Now, like I said at the start, this is almost like a 2-part episode because you'll also be able to take a listen to Natalie Warren, the author of the book as well. That episode is going to be coming out in the next couple of days, and Natalie's going to be sharing more about her journey, her view of the challenge. She's also going to be sharing more about canoeing the length of the Mississippi River and winning winning first place in the Yukon River Quest in the Women's Voyager Division, which involved paddling 450 miles in 53 hours. When I was speaking with Natalie and Anne, they also talked about one of their other friends, a fabulous lady called youve. And we actually spoke with their friend Lee on the 23rd of February 2021. And Lee comes on the Tough Girl podcast and she shares more about her experience of paddling the Mississippi River, so 2,300 plus miles, and also talks in more detail about winning the Women's Voyager Division in the Yukon River Quest, so paddling that 450 odd miles in 53 hours. So I really sort of like those connections. So if you can listen to those sort of 3 episodes together, I think it would work really, really well. So you can listen to Anne, Natalie and Lee, and who all talk about their paddling experiences from their different viewpoints. So well worth listening to. If you want to learn more about Tough Girl Challenges and the guests that we have on, then please do go and visit toughgirlchallenges.com. That's basically the main central website with links to everything that we have talked about. There's also links to all of my social media accounts on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And there's also our patrons page as well. So I just want to say a big thank you to all the patrons who do support the Tough Girl podcast. If you decide to support the Tough Girl podcast, then you will get your name on the dedicated patrons page as well. To find out more about supporting Tough Girl podcast, if you visit Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl podcast, you can support in dollars, euros and sterling, and you can help me to increase the amount of female role models in the media. Have an awesome day wherever you are, whatever you are doing. Give it your all. Give it 110%. Get after it. New episode of the Tough Girl podcast come out on a Tuesday and a Thursday at 7 a.m. UK time. So hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out. Take care. Lots of love and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.